Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a stack of your sources here today. Articles, research, notes, all focused on, well, understanding the journey of autism spectrum disorder.
That's right. And our goal is to walk you through this material, pull out the key insights. We'll trace how the understanding evolved, look at how diagnosis changed so much.
And why the numbers went up so dramatically.
Exactly. And how support has shifted over time, too.
And digging into these sources, there are definitely some surprises waiting. Hints of autism going way, way back.
Millennia, even.
Yeah, and a key early researcher who often gets sort of overlooked.
Mm.
Plus, the main reason for that big jump in diagnoses, it might not be what you think. Should be some real aha moments.
Definitely. Okay, let's dive in.
All right, so first let's ground ourselves. Based on these sources, how do we understand autism spectrum disorder today?
So the sources describe ASD as this complex neurodevelopmental condition. The core things are these persistent differences in social communication, social interaction, and also restricted repetitive patterns, behavior, interests, activities. And these usually show up in early childhood. They can impact daily life.
So differences in connecting, communicating, experiencing the world, maybe sensory stuff, needing things to be the same.
Exactly. That's a good summary.
But you mentioned ancient history. Were these kinds of traits always around in people?
The sources really point to yes. I mean, the clinical term, the name autism, that's pretty new.
Yeah.
But traits that, looking back, really align with what we now call autism. They seem to pop up in historical records long before any formal medical definition.
Really? Where do the sources point for that?
Well, they mention descriptions in ancient texts. Greece, India, there's talk of Unmata, accounts from China, even the Edwin Smith papyrus from ancient Egypt. We're talking thousands of years ago.
Wow, thousands.
Descriptions of conditions involving, say, social withdrawal or communication difficulties. It suggests these variations have likely been part of human diversity for a very long time.
That's fascinating.
And then fast forward a bit, 19th century European doctors, they also made observations. People like Esquirol talking about monomania, intense focus maybe. John Down on developmental retardation, Kussmaul noting aphasia voluntaria.
Voluntary, not speaking.
Oh, like choosing not to speak, yeah.
Yeah.
It could fit. And the sources also mention speculation about historical figures, right?
Yeah, like Cavendish, the scientist, maybe Einstein, Newton, showing traits like social awkwardness, intense interests, repetitive things.
Right. And the key takeaway from all this historical stuff, according to these sources, is that the underlying neurobiology, the differences we link to autism now, they're not new. They've always been part of the human mix.
Okay, so the traits were there, but without a name, without a framework, how were people seen, treated?
Well, often just labeled different, maybe eccentric, sometimes misdiagnosed with other things, or occasionally unusual abilities might even be seen as, supernatural.
Right.
And this historical confusion, the mislabeling, it really drives home why having a clear diagnostic framework is so important. The sources stress this, it's crucial for getting the right support and avoiding marginalization.
Which brings us to when someone actually first used the word autism.
Okay, yeah. That was Eugen Bleuler, a Swiss psychiatrist back in 1911.
And the sources say his context is really important here.
It absolutely is. Bleuler worked mainly on schizophrenia, and he used autism to describe a symptom of severe schizophrenia. For him, it meant this kind of detachment from reality, an intense inner life, linked to what he called impaired, self-centered thinking.
So completely different from how we see it now as its own thing.
Totally different. And that early association with schizophrenia stuck for decades. It really hampered separate research and, finding the right kind of help for what we now know is a distinct neurodevelopmental condition.
That's a major fork in the road, terminology-wise. But then your sources bring up this fascinating figure, that first surprise, someone who actually got it much closer, much earlier, but isn't as well known.
Yes, Grunya Sukhareva, a Russian child psychiatrist. Her work is incredible. She published these really detailed descriptions of children way back in 1926.
1926, that's what, almost 20 years before Kanner and Asperger?
Exactly. 2 decades before the names usually credited as the pioneers, she used terms like schizoid psychopathy at first, later autistic psychopathy. But her descriptions, they nail so many traits we recognize today.
Like what? What did she describe?
Okay, she talked about peculiar thinking patterns and autistic attitudes, sort of aloofness, bring to be alone, flatness, and emotional expression, this real inflexibility or need for sameness, unusual behaviors, repetitive language, even obsessive-compulsive traits. And crucially, she noted a lack of facial expression and sensory differences, too.
Wow. It really sounds like she was seeing the core features.
It really does. Her
Mhm.
descriptions were detailed, empathetic. It just shows a more accurate understanding was definitely emerging earlier than we often think, based on her careful observations.
So, Bleuler misapplies the term, Sukareva gets it right but isn't widely known in the West. And then we get to Kanner and Asperger, the foundational figures.
Precisely. Leo Kanner, working in the U.S., published his big paper Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact in 1943. That's usually seen as the point where early infantile autism became recognized as a distinct syndrome.
And what did he observe in those 11 children he wrote about?
He highlighted things like extreme autistic aloneness, this intense, almost anxious need for sameness, major difficulties relating to people, odd speech patterns like delayed echolalia or pronoun reversal, unusual rhythm in speech.
Prosody.
Yeah, prosody. And these really intense, narrow interests in objects or routines. But importantly, the sources note he also saw that these children were often quite intelligent, despite the social and communication challenges.
Did his thinking stay the same after that first paper?
No, and that's really important. His view evolved. Initially, maybe 1944, he did lean towards it being a type of childhood schizophrenia, sort of echoing Bleuler. But later, by 1969, he changed his tune significantly. He specifically rejected the awful refrigerator mother theory.
Which we definitely need to talk about.
Absolutely. And he strongly asserted that autism had a biological, likely inherited basis. He even mentioned increased head circumference in some kids, something that, connects with modern research on early brain growth.
So his 43 paper marks that shift from symptom to syndrome, and then he later reinforces the biological idea.
You got it. And right around the same time, totally independently over in Austria, you have Hans Asperger. He was describing kids with similar difficulties, but often with average or even advanced language skills and cognitive abilities.
And that's where Asperger's syndrome eventually came from.
Yes. Asperger's focus was maybe a bit different from Kanner's initial group. He often highlighted the unique strengths and abilities he saw. But fundamentally, both Kanner and Asperger describe those core challenges: social interaction, communication, and those restricted interests or repetitive behaviors, that triad of impairments.
The fact they both saw it independently, that's powerful.
It really is. And your sources highlight how their dual perspectives, Kanner on individuals needing more support, Asperger on those often called higher functioning, really laid the groundwork for the whole autism spectrum idea later on. It was vital for seeing autism wasn't just one thing.
Okay, before we move on from them, the refrigerator mother theory. Kanner rejected it, you said. What was it, and why is it so critical to address?
Oh, it was this incredibly damaging theory. It gained traction in the 50s and 60s, pushed by people like Bruno Bettelheim. It basically came from psychoanalysis and blamed autism on mothers being cold, rejecting, unemotional.
Blaming the parents. For a neurodevelopmental condition, that's just
Ugh.
awful.
It's horrific. And it led to terrible practices, like parentectomy, literally taking children away from their families based on this completely false idea.
Mm.
But, as your sources state very clearly, Kanner himself eventually disavowed it, and solid biological and genetic research totally debunked it. Getting past that theory was absolutely essential for progress.
Okay, so Kanner and Asperger define the syndrome, hint at the spectrum. How did this understanding then get baked into the official diagnostic manuals, like the DSM?
Right. The DSM journey really mirrors how our understanding changed.
Starting when it was still tangled up with schizophrenia.
Yeah, DSM-I in 52, DSM-2 in 68. Autism was mostly seen as a symptom of schizophrenia,
Yeah.
which, as we said, meant people weren't getting the right kind of assessment or help because it wasn't seen as its own thing.
Until DSM-3. That was the
Yeah.
big change.
Huge turning point. DSM-3, 1980. Infantile autism finally gets listed as a distinct developmental disorder, separate from schizophrenia. It laid out specific criteria: onset before 30 months, language issues, odd responses to the world. Your sources really emphasize how crucial this standardization was. It gave clinicians a clearer target, boosted awareness, and definitely led to more diagnoses.
And the next version, DSM-3R.
That refined things a bit in 87. Added PDD to NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. That was for kids who had autistic traits but didn't quite meet the full criteria for infantile autism. It also loosened the strict age requirement a bit and needed fewer criteria overall, a bit more flexible.
Then DSM-IV in 94, that's where the spectrum idea really comes in formally.
Exactly. DSM-IV is where autism as a spectrum gets official recognition. It listed 5 conditions under the PDD umbrella: autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, PDD-NOS, Rett disorder, and childhood disintegrative disorder, CDD. And the criteria required issues across all 3 areas of that triad: social, communication, and restricted repetitive patterns.
Just to clarify, those sources point out Rett and CDD were in that PDD list, but they're different from the others, right?
Absolutely right to clarify. Rett and CDD were under that umbrella then, but they have distinct causes and features. The ones that really formed the core of what became ASD later were autistic disorder, Asperger's, and PDD-NOS.
Got it. Which leads us to the most recent big change, DSM-5 in 2013.
Right, DSM-5 was all about consolidation. It took autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD-NOS, and merged them all into one single diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. It also restructured the criteria into just 2 core domains.
2 domains.
Yeah. 1, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. And 2, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities.
And importantly, the sources highlight that DSM-5 explicitly put sensory issues into that second domain criteria. That wasn't as formal before.
Correct. A very important addition, reflecting what clinicians and autistic people themselves were saying. DSM-5 also tried to align better with the international ICD classification and, crucially, acknowledged masking, that traits might be hidden by learned coping strategies, especially in adults or females, making diagnosis trickier sometimes. If you look at that table 1 you provided, you can really see the shift visually from a narrow box to this broad spectrum under one name.
Yeah, that table really shows the evolution, which leads directly to the big question everyone grapples with, those prevalence numbers.
Yeah.
Why the huge jump? What do your sources say?
They lay out the numbers pretty starkly. Back in the 60s, estimates were like 1 in 2,500, maybe 1 in 10,000.
Yeah.
1970s, maybe 1 in 2,000.
And today, totally different story.
Look at the CVC data you pulled together. 2,000, 1 in 150 kids. 2010, 1 in 68. 2020, 1 in 36. And the latest, 2022, has it at 1 in 31 children in the U.S. That table 2 just shows this relentless upward curve.
Going from 1 in 150 to 1 in 31 in, just over 2 decades, that feels massive.
Hey.
Is autism actually becoming that much more common?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the overwhelming consensus in your sources is probably not. Not a significant true increase in the underlying condition itself. The dramatic rise is mostly about us getting better at identifying it.
Okay, so that's the surprising insight you mentioned. The main driver isn't some new epidemic, it's that we're just finding it more.
Essentially, yes. The sources are quite clear. Those changes in diagnostic criteria we just talked about, broadening the definition with DSM-IV spectrum and DSM-5's consolidation, that's seen as the single biggest factor. It simply brought more people with a wider range of traits under the ASD label who wouldn't have been diagnosed before.
Makes sense. What else contributes to finding it more?
Well, general awareness is huge. Think about advocacy groups, public information campaigns, doctors and teachers being better trained. Parents and educators are just more likely now to spot potential signs and seek an evaluation. That naturally leads to earlier identification.
And things like routine screening tests.
Definitely. Those screenings at well-child checkups, like the MCHAT, they catch kids earlier. And clinicians generally are just better trained now to recognize the diverse ways autism can look, not just the classic picture Kanner first described.
The sources also mention societal shifts in policies.
Yeah, a couple things. Less institutionalization means more autistic people are visible in the community. And then there was a really practical policy driver, particularly in the U.S., a 1991 Department of Education ruling. It basically said an autism diagnosis made a child eligible for special education services in school.
So getting the diagnosis opened doors to needed support.
Exactly. It created a very real incentive for families to pursue a diagnosis to get their child help. We're also seeing better identification now in communities that were historically missed. The latest CDC data actually shows prevalence is now higher among Black, Hispanic, and Asian or Pacific Islander children than white children, which flips the old pattern. Schools are often where identification happens now.
Okay, so improved identification explains most of the rise in diagnoses. But what about the actual causes of autism? Why is someone autistic in the first place?
Right, the underlying biology. The understanding now is that it's a complex mix of genetics and environmental factors interacting, affecting how the brain develops very early on. Your sources cite high heritability genetics play a big role, maybe 60–90% of the risk, with a heritability index around 0.9. And it's usually polygenic.
Meaning lots of genes involved, not just one.
Correct. Not a single autism gene. And The environment. Those factors are seen more as risk modifiers, things that might nudge the risk up or down in someone already genetically susceptible. Things like older parents, certain exposures during pregnancy, maybe pollution, pesticides, some medications, mom's health during pregnancy, birth complications like being very premature.
So let's just hammer this home, because it's crucial based on the sources. Genetics and environment cause autism, but they likely explain only a tiny fraction of the increase in diagnosed numbers. That surge is overwhelmingly about better identification.
Precisely. That's the main message from your sources on prevalence.
And we absolutely have to touch on the vaccine myth. It still lingers out there.
Yes, and it's vital to be crystal clear, as your sources are. Decades, literally decades of rigorous scientific research involving millions of children have found absolutely no link between vaccines, including the MMR vaccine and autism. Zero. The original study suggesting a link by Andrew Wakefield. It was retracted, shown to be based on fraudulent data, and he lost his medical license over it. The science on this is settled. Unequivocal.
Thank you. Very important to state that clearly. Okay, so moving beyond prevalence. How has the scientific understanding of autism's biology evolved?
It's been a massive shift from those early, frankly, baseless psychoanalytic ideas like the refrigerator mother theory to a solid understanding rooted in neurobiology, how the autistic brain develops and connects differently. And Kanner, to his credit, was pushing for a biological view early on.
What does current research, based on your sources, tell us about those brain differences?
Well, autism is seen as this complex, highly heritable neurodevelopmental condition. It stems from those gene-environment interactions affecting early brain wiring. Research points to differences in areas like the association cortex, the parts involved in complex thought. There's evidence of altered connectivity, both in the long-range white matter tracts.
The brain's highways.
Kinda, yeah. And also differences in how nearby brain regions connect and communicate within the cortex. Some studies find structural differences too, like maybe a smaller corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres.
And didn't Kanner mention head circumference? Does that connect?
It does resonate, yeah. Modern research shows some autistic infants have patterns of rapid head and brain growth, especially in the first year or so. Researchers are also digging into epigenetics, how environment influences gene activity and specific genes, like one called the M receptor gene, looking at how they impact brain development and maybe other body systems too.
That journey from blaming parents to studying complex brain development, it's huge progress.
It really is.
Yeah.
And all this ongoing neurobiological research, the hope is it leads to more personalized, effective supports down the line.
Speaking of support, how have the interventions offered actually changed? Because those early practices sound pretty bad.
Yeah, some were truly harmful. Institutionalization was common, just hiding people away. Ineffective, sometimes dangerous methods, like early ECT versions were tried. That awful parentectomy. Early dietary things often lacked evidence. And sadly, some early behavioral methods used punishment.
Aversives.
Yes, aversives, which are obviously unethical, not best practice now, and mostly banned. Things like auditory integration training also pop up as lacking solid evidence in the sources.
A dark history there. But things shifted towards evidence-based approaches.
Thankfully, yes. A big shift came with applied behavior analysis, ABA, starting in the 70s and 80s. It was much more systematic, individualized, using principles like positive reinforcement to teach skills.
And ABA itself has evolved.
Oh, definitely. Modern ABA, as your sources describe it, looks quite different. There's much more focus on goals that are meaningful to the autistic person, building on strengths, respecting neurodiversity, and moving away from rigid or punitive stuff. It's still considered a key approach for many, helping with communication, social skills, daily living.
What other therapies are really central now?
Speech and language therapy is huge, targeting those core communication differences. Helping with language, understanding social cues, maybe using AAC or PECVs for non-speaking individuals. Occupational therapy, OT, is vital for sensory and motor challenges. OTs help with daily skills, managing sensory sensitivities, creating sensory diets, self-care, regulation, improving quality of life.
And school-based support.
Crucial. Educational therapy, structured programs, specialist teams. The sources highlight effective strategies like visual supports, using special interest to motivate learning, structured play, positive feedback, creating social opportunities. Early intensive programs often show great results.
Is medication used?
Yes, but it's important to be clear, as the sources are. Medications don't treat the core features of autism itself. They're used to manage related challenges like significant hyperactivity, aggression, anxiety, sleep problems. Things like certain antipsychotics, antidepressants, stimulants might be used carefully.
And alternative approaches.
Things like art or music therapy, sensory integration activities, sometimes melatonin for sleep, massage, pet therapy, they get mentioned. But the sources generally note the research evidence is often mixed or limited, so they're usually best seen as complementary, alongside the proven therapies.
Your sources really hammer home the importance of early intervention.
Absolutely paramount. The brain is most adaptable, most neuroplastic early in life. Getting the right support early leads to much better outcomes long-term in communication, social skills, managing behavior, overall development.
So the gold standard now is really individualized collaborative care.
Exactly. Tailored plans based on the person's unique profile with everyone, professionals, parents, caregivers, and increasingly the autistic person themselves working together. This whole evolution in support. It reflects a growing understanding, moving from harmful myths to evidence-based, empowering, and increasingly neurodiversity-affirming ways of helping.
It feels like this change in support goes hand in hand with a bigger societal shift too, from just knowing about autism to really accepting it.
Yes, that's a really powerful theme in your sources, driven largely by advocacy. We've seen this move from just autism awareness, okay, we know it exists, to actively promoting autism acceptance. That means creating inclusive spaces, recognizing rights and contributions, valuing neurodiversity. Think about the shift from Autism Awareness Month to Autism Acceptance Month.
And this is where the neurodiversity movement comes in strongly.
Precisely. It's a fundamental perspective shift. Neurodiversity sees autism not just as a deficit or disorder needing a cure, but as a natural variation in how human brains work, with its own strengths and challenges. It pushes back against the purely medical model and argues for accepting autistic ways of being like stimming, different eye contact norms, intense interests.
And the idea that autistic people should lead the conversation about autism.
Absolutely central. The motto, nothing about us without us. The movement also critiques therapies focused solely on making autistic people appear non-autistic, or masking, pointing to the mental health costs of that.
Advocacy groups have obviously been key drivers.
Hugely important. Long-standing groups like the Autism Society of America provide vital education and resources. But critically, you also have autistic-led organizations like the Autism Network International, ANI, formed back in '92. They created resources by and for autistic people, ran events like Treat. They really champion autistic community, address things like the double empathy problem.
Meaning the communication gap goes both ways.
Exactly. It's not just an autistic deficit. They advocate for reforming services based on neurodiversity principles.
And this has even affected language, right? The autistic person versus person with autism debate.
It has. Many in the movement prefer identity-first language, autistic person, arguing autism is core to identity, not something separate you just have. It pushes back against terms like suffers from. It fosters a sense of shared experience, even autistic culture. And your sources mention how online spaces have been crucial for autistic people connecting and building that community.
Has this advocacy translated into global policy?
To some extent, yes. Things like the DACA Declaration, UN resolutions, a WHO resolution, they've put autism on the global health map, stressing early diagnosis, inclusion, support. Many countries now have laws protecting rights and ensuring services.
A far cry from some media portrayals, like the savant stereotype.
Right, which advocacy groups constantly challenge, along with the idea it's only a childhood thing. This whole shift towards acceptance and neurodiversity shows society maturing in its understanding, thanks in huge part to self-advocates demanding their voices be heard, moving us beyond just deficits to valuing autistic people for who they are.
Well, that was quite the journey through these sources. We've traced understanding from those ancient hints, through formal definitions, the critical shift to a spectrum concept. And importantly, we've really unpacked that huge rise in diagnoses, mostly better identification, not some scary epidemic.
We've seen the science evolve from blame to neurobiology, interventions transform from harmful to helpful, and heard the powerful rise of the neurodiversity movement championing acceptance.
And bringing it back to you, our listener, why does this history matter? Well, understanding where we came from helps us appreciate the progress. It challenges those old, damaging ideas, and it really underscores why accurate identification and true societal acceptance are so vital today. It's about enabling autistic people to thrive.
Exactly. It makes you think, doesn't it? How will this ongoing journey, finding that balance between providing needed support and truly embracing neurodiversity, valuing different ways of thinking and being, how will that shape the future for autistic individuals? What new insights or maybe new challenges lie ahead in the next chapter?